So one observation concerns the difficulty in defining what we have come to term Cretan literature. Now that no one writes in the Cretan dialect, what qualifies as Cretan literature? It seems to me that in principle the definition bifurcates into two distinct conditions: literature that has been written by authors born in Crete, and literature written on the subject of Crete. Each condition perhaps does not suffice on its own. There are those who think that both need to be fulfilled if a text is to be classified as Cretan. But even if we define the conditions, another problem appears. Is it valid to distinguish a Cretan literature against a national Greek literature? And if so, should we then distinguish a Macedonian literature or a Corphiot literature or a Cycladic literature? Complications arising when considering locality as a filter in literary criticism are endless. The second observation concerns the title chosen for this conference, From Kornaros to Kazantzakis. This title perhaps reflects the span of David Holton's literary interests, but it also reflects the common but problematic belief that literary activity began in Crete in the Renaissance and ended in the mid-20th century with the death of Kazantzakis.
It had to be flashy, you know, it
Yeah.
wasn't.
This time span surely defines the boundaries of what is considered by many to be a canon of Cretan writing. And while I'm not qualified to assess whether the beginning of this canonical period should be positioned in the Renaissance, I do not think there are adequate reasons for anyone to claim that Kazantzakis' death in 1957 marked the end of Crete's literary tradition. A panel tomorrow will discuss a significant post-Kazantzakian output of Cretan writing. It is a relief to know that I don't stand out as the only one thinking that Cretan literature must be discussed beyond Kazantzakis, even in a conference entitled From Kornaros to Kazantzakis. Cretan literature beyond Kazantzakis deserves a systematic study that will define its genealogy as well as its specific traits and characteristics. As tomorrow's panel indicates, Rea Galanaki and Marodouka are central figures in it. These two female authors, born in Iraklion and Chania respectively, rediscovered Crete in novels that can be termed historical. Rea Galanakis' Ovios to Ismail Ferik Pasha, published in 1989, led the Greek historical novel into the postmodern era. The main character's double identity as a Muslim and a Christian, the fluid boundaries between historiography and storytelling, and the novel's open ending are just a few features that subverted the traditional form of the historical novel. Galanaki would let 13 years lapse before she occupied herself with Crete again in the novel Koeonas των Labyrinthon, on the subject of Minoan archaeology. This was closely followed by Amylita Βαθιά νερά, which details a story of a kidnap in 1950, and Φωτιές του Ιούδα, Στάχτες του Ιδίπποδα in 2009. These three novels perhaps constitute an informal Cretan trilogy. Marodouka's preoccupation with Crete follows a very similar pattern. So she first dealt with the island in the mid-1970s in the isolated stories Κάτι άνθρωποι and Πού είναι τα φτερά, which drew from her own memories as a child in Crete. But the historical interest in Crete was mainly channeled in the last 10 years through the three novels Αθώοι και φταίχτες, Το δίκαιο είναι ζώρικο πολύ, which probes the history of Crete during the Axis occupation, and the Fresh from the Press, Έλα να πούμε ψέματα, that continues this historical probing into the Greek Civil War. So it's perhaps interesting to think, why do we have so many novels on the subject of Crete in the first decade of the 21st century? To make a literary case out of Crete's history and topography, as these two female authors repeatedly do, is to stress its differences from mainland Greece, but also its exceptional status among the Greek islands. Yet in a sense, both Galanaki and Douka's novels do not just reflect Cretan exceptionalism, they also perform it, they also construct it. This does not happen in the glorifying manner of Kazantzakis. One should not expect to find in Galanaki or Douka a valorization of Cretan bravery, customs and history, as Kazantzakis does in novels such as O Kapitan Michalis. This is a photograph taken by the female photographer Nellis in the 1930s of Cretan man. But it still happens. Both authors' obsession with Crete performs it as a semi-autonomous entity within the borders of the Greek state. But we must not forget that Galanaki and Douka operate within a postmodern literary environment, while at the same time they're important players in a national, not just Cretan, literary market. Thus they contextualize Cretan history within a wider framework of Greek and European history. Crete's locality in their novels is discussed in a way that shows how relevant it is to the rest of Greece. In contrast to Galanaki and Douka, Yorgis Yatromanolakis' prose fiction seems to be in a constantly open dialogue with Kazantzakis. The epic proportion of Kazantzakis' writing is somewhat echoed in Yatromanolakis' constant appraisal of Crete. Here we'll discuss three of Yatromanolakis' novels, which to my mind constitute a sort of informal Cretan trilogy: Ιστορία, Ανοφελές διήγημα, and Βιβλίων καλούμενων ερωτικών. Yatromanolakis returned to the subject of Crete in the 2005 historical novel Ο παππούς μου και το κακό, inspired by Crete's most eminent politician, Eleftherios Venizelos. Born in Heraklion, Yatromanolakis renders Crete an exceptional locus in his prose fiction. His novels feature Crete's history, topography, cultural norms, and literary ancestry. Having written about Crete before Galanaki and Douka in the more prosperous 1980s and 1990s, Yatromanolakis was lucky to have all three novels discussed here, plus the earlier Limonario translated into English and published by Daedalus, a small, now extinct publishing house that specialized in translated works. Ιστορία, rendered as the history of a vendetta, and Ανοφελές διήγημα, rendered as a report of a murder, were translated by Helen Kavanagh in 1991 and 1995 respectively, while Βιβλίων καλούμενων ερωτικών, rendered as Ερωτικών, was translated by David Connolly in 1999. In this paper, I will present the specific traits that make up this novel's Cretan flavor and discuss how their locality is a seminal ingredient in their postmodernism. Subsequently, we'll discuss whether these Cretan features can be preserved in translation, while also assessing the individual translator's approach as regards this subject. Do translations aim at bringing this novel's Cretanness to the fore, or do they intend to let it merge with a more generic Greekness, or do they intend to suppress it altogether? How important is it to render Yatromanolakis' Cretan traits in translation, and how easily can they be rendered in translation? Despite being set in Crete, the novel Ιστορία does not directly capitalize on Cretan topography. Crete in this novel is a suggestive backdrop given away by cultural landmarks rather than named. There are Cretan names, references to the coexistence of Christians and Muslims, references to Cretan agricultural products such as carrots, raisins, honey, and silk, and subtle historical cues, such as a strong support for Eleftherios Venizelos, himself also from the area of Chania. In August 1928, Pavlos Dikeos killed Emmanuel Zervos, this is the plot of the novel, over a financial dispute. The killing was premeditated, and the perpetrator fled to the mountains where he hid for 9 days, after which he made himself available to the authorities for arrest. He died in jail. 3 years later, the son of the victim, Marcos Zervos, killed the son of the murderer, Yorgis Dikeos, an only child, thus wiping out the family lineage. He remained a fugitive for 4 years, after which he got parole, thus avoiding jail altogether. Yatromanolakis never uses the word vendetta in his novel. He entitles it simply Ιστορία, which means both history and story, doubling perhaps George Seferis' ambiguous title Mythistórημα. It is a narrative of a specific event, a killing, which purportedly happened over personal reasons. Thus, Yatromanolakis effectively shows what is termed personal, such as the financial dispute, is deeply embedded in historical factors. Dikeos, who befriended Zervos while they both served in Venizelos' guard in 1914, would not have killed him were it not for a change of interconnected historical events. Venizelos' MPs trying to secure local support by granting favours, and the economic decline of Greece in the 1920s, which made it hard for individuals to borrow money from the state, thus ending up borrowing from usurers such as Zervos. You can see here the cover in the Greek edition, how much it underlines this historical aspect. It sort of is presented as a kind of faded photograph, and you can see the stamp from the Υπηρεσία Λογοκρισίας Τύπου, the censorship sort of office in the press. And this is how the cover was rendered in the English edition. You can see that the historical aspect has disappeared here. So Dikios is presented by killing Zervos. Dikios is presented as implementing human justice. I quote, "For example, a man can work from dawn to dusk with the simple purpose of increasing his property and wealth. A man lends the money he makes at a high interest, buys cheap and sells dear, gets involved in party politics and attracts voters by lots of promises and bribery, and so contributes to his favorite candidate always being elected, and increases his own influence and the power of the so-called bourgeois establishment and the Liberal Party. By appearances, this man is committing no injustice or doing anything absolutely wrong. In a case like this, neither divine justice nor the laws of the state can be applied, even if this law-abiding citizen and owner of wealth were to come one morning to your vineyard and ask to be paid back for past loans which have been repaid again and again. It is then that you have to mete out human justice personally and thus guide the hand of divine justice. Keeping very calm, without fear, you must load the mannlicher with your cleanest and best polished bullet, and aim low in the stomach at the point where the upper body meets the lower." While the ambiguous title Historia in Greek can be taken as story and history, the English translator Helen Kavanagh chose the title The History of a Vendetta. One can understand the reasons for this choice. The word history does not have the same ambiguity in English. At the same time, the vendetta has come to be associated with the island. A search for Cretan vendetta on Google yields to about 113,000 results. The Wikipedia entry for Crete lists the vendetta among the island's cultural features. Thus, the title of The History of a Vendetta makes the novel more marketable in English, not least because it contains an exportable cultural feature. However, the translator includes a table of main historical events, from the fall of Constantinople to the death of Venizelos, in an attempt to inform readers of the island's history. The novel, I think, works well in English because there is no overwhelming detail as regards history or topography. Generic place names such as main village or county's capital make it easier for the English-speaking reader to follow, concentrating on the myth's essence, the killing and its motives. Another familiarizing factor is the novel's indebtedness to magic realism, a novelistic genre that became an international literary sensation from the 1970s onwards. In a typical magic realist fashion, Historia tells the story of two families with distinct genealogies. Miraculous events occur despite the realist setting, such as the body of Zervos, the victim, becoming wax, soap and silk after his death, imitating the three products he manufactured. While Historia is topographically as generic as can be, Anopheles Diήγημα is quite the opposite, the apogee of spatial detail. Cretan topography, with an emphasis on the county of Heraklion, is meticulously described with the effect of a virtual map reading. The novel is based on a true event. In November 1990, Yorgos Yatromanolakis, a postgraduate student at the Department of Physics in the University of Crete, opened fire during a research seminar, killing 2 professors and wounding 3 others. The perpetrator escaped in a borrowed car and committed suicide on the mountains. His body was found by a local shepherd in a mummified state in July of the following year, almost 8 months after the crime was committed. The narrative is taken up by an anonymous member of the community who composes a detailed report on the murder based on forensic evidence, but also on the event's coverage in the press, national and local. While the narrator claims to have used scientific methods similar to those employed by members in the physics department, he realizes that he cannot give an objective account of the event, that an objective account is in fact impossible. Hence the title of the novel, Anopheles diήγημα. It is a phrase found in the ancient historian Polybius, who notes in his history of the Carthago Wars that stripped of truth and objectivity, historiography is reduced to a useless tale, an anopheles diήγημα. This narrator regards the murder as having implications, political, in the wider sense. The postgraduate student was poor and was seeking EU funding in order to finish his PhD thesis without ever managing to secure it. There is a constant reminder of the unprivileged status Greece has among EU member states. And you need to remember that this was in the 1990s, so it was before the expansion of the EU. To compensate for this unprivileged status, the narrator celebrates Crete by describing it as the center of the world. Here I stand in the center of the whole world, visible and invisible, and from here I send my cult throughout the Greek archipelago, from harsh Macronissos to our Asia Minor coast, and from the cliffs of Lemnos and Samothrace to the streams of Rhodes and Castellorizo. This cretocentrism materializes through lavish descriptions of the area around Heraklion and an obsessive reference to place names. The 7 districts of Heraklion are named one by one just in the space of one paragraph: Malevisi, Priotissa, Temeni, Castelnuovo, Castellio, Bonifacio, and Viana. The mention entails an act of sharing the love for the place, but in a novel that criticizes the EU, it is important for these place names to sound in Greek as a kind of protest of locality, a kind of political statement. But I cannot help wondering how the English-speaking reader may respond to their overwhelming number and how alienating they may be for readers who know nothing about the island. What makes Anopheles diήγημα particularly difficult to translate is its complicated intertextual baggage. Polybius in the title is abandoned in the English translation for the more popular Report of a Murder, which brands the book as a crime novel. But the main body of text also teems with literary allusion. References to Homer, found among others in the standard adjectives used with place names, such as virtual Macedonia, corrupt Athens, etc. Biblical language, references to Cretan Renaissance, literature of the Cretan Renaissance, such as the chapter entitled Intermezzo, found in the middle of the novel, which reminders of the intermedia in Erofil. Finally, there is a rich number of intertextual references to modern Greek texts. The prophetic tone of the novel's parenthetic phrases addressed to the killer by a prophetic voice echoes Elitis' action esteem, while references to Solomos and Seferis also add to the mixture. How important are these references? In the introduction to the novel, Andrew Crummy writes, "It should be emphasized, however, that the wealth of literary and mythological allusion in the book is intended for the most part to go unnoticed by the reader. Every author takes pleasure in burying secrets within his work." I'm not sure this is the case. I think the same way that Cretan place names are an important ingredient in constructing locality, intertextual allusions also play a vital role. However, to my mind, Andrew Crummy's comment reads as an attempt at winning over those readers who may be put off by the novel's complicated intertextual baggage. Intertextuality is driven to an extreme in the novel Βιβλίων Καλούμενων Ερωτικών, a novel written as a practical guide to lovemaking. Written in the style of love manuals such as the Kama Sutra, Erotikon does not have a plot. Its subject is perhaps more than anything else the language in which it is written and the rich network of literary allusion on which it depends. It emulates a treatise on agriculture entitled Geoponikon. The treatise, which also contained advice on medical matters, was written in 1643 by the Cretan monk Agapios Lanthos. Landos did not have first-hand knowledge on agricultural matters, but admitted to having studied a number of philosophical sources. The language used by Landos is a mixture of 17th century Cretan dialect and archaic Greek. Yatromanolakis draws his own novel on the pattern of Landos, but underlines the Cretan character of his text even more with additional references to Cretan Renaissance literature. You can see that the presentation of the book follows all the conventions Cretan works followed during the Renaissance. The work is dedicated to an erudite lady, while the author presents himself as Dottore di Filosofia, con licenza de superiori e privilegi. References are made to a host of works that are inspired by Crete and Cretan literature, such as Dionysios Solomos' narrative poem O Kritikos. Thus, in this novel, Cretanness is achieved by intertextual allusion. What is the translator supposed to do with that? I have argued in an earlier article that the cultural specificity of intertexts that are known only in the source language is lost in translation. In the case of Landos' treatise, it is not recognizable even to Greek readers. But even allusion to texts that have fared better in the Greek literary canon, such as Solomos' O Kritikos, does not survive in translation. What does survive, though, is the sense of linguistic alienation in that refreshing, positive sense that kindles a reader's interest. And I quote the Greek text so you can see how the language is different from contemporary standard modern Greek. All that you can see, this is the cover of the English translation. Come back to that. Έπαρε μετασέ και δόξασε έως καρδία στην μοναξίαν σου, σύντας τα εύσαρκα των ονείρων αναζητούν το μοναχικόν και το αερόδες. Στρώσε εις ελοτζέταν ορθάνικτην με συμπρινήν, για να επισκοπείς ευκρινώς πάντα στους αστερισμούς του σύμπαντος, αμή και την πουλιαν την κοινήν, αντάμα με τον αλέκτορα το φωσφορούχο. It is this sense of alienation that should be appropriated by the translator because it allows them to compensate for the loss of the culturally specific intertext. The inventive translator can find equivalent ways of alienating the reader in the target language, and he does in the case of Erotikon, resorting to 19th century translations of the Kama Sutra into English, and the sensual novel Perfume Garden by Richard F. Burton. It is this sense of distance and alienation from the standard everyday language that can be creatively reconstructed in translation, rather than the cultural specificity of the intertext. By resorting to intertext on the theme of love for vocabulary, the translator consciously exacerbates its erotic theme. In English, the novel reads as just an erotic novel rather than an erotic novel that is also a postmodern exercise in style. In this paper, I have argued that defining Cretan literature against national literature is problematic and should be discussed. I have tried to fit Yatromanolakis' Cretan novels in a genealogy of post-Kazantzakian authors. Yatromanolakis reconstructs Cretanness through history, national and local, in Historia, through topography in Anopheles Diήγημα, and through intertextuality and language in Βιβλίων καλούμενων Ερωτικών. The specificity and exceptionality of Crete within the Greek state is to a large extent lost in translation. Despite the fact that translators try to add a bit of context in the form of tables of historical events or introductions, it is impossible for the average English-speaking reader to perceive Crete as an exceptional locus within Greece, as perhaps a Greek reader would not fully grasp the implications of a Sicilian author writing in Sicily in Italian. It is rather the case that the reader reads Crete as part of Greece. Locality is lost in favor of other aspects of the text. In the case of Historia and Anopheles Diήγημα, it is the story of the crime that acts as this novel's greatest attraction. And in Erotikon, it is the erotic theme, always a winner in high and low literature alike, that takes over. Thank you.
Well, I think we have been treated to another excellent paper. What an interesting session this one was. And thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. I was thinking as you were reading about Yatromanolakis' Historia and then Anopheles Diήγημα, actually Historia is also You said Anopheles diihima is also an allusion to Polybius. I think Historia uses as an epigraph Herodotus. And I was wondering to what extent this connection with Herodotus, as the connection with Polybius and Anopheles diihima, has anything to do with the whole way Yatromanolakis is writing, as also the fact that he chooses for both of these novels the crime element, the murder element, and why. And also, I was wondering to what extent Papargyriou' Phonissa, especially in Historia, can be seen as a kind of precursor, because there's a similar stage of the murderer being in nature and going through a process of purification or transformation. Something like that.
Yeah, well, Herodotus is an interesting one, because perhaps among the historiographers of antiquity, he's perhaps the most magical. And I think that ties in well with Yatromanolakis' interest in magic realism. So I
and
think
the double meaning of Historia.
Yes, and he merges sort of like magic realism with Herodotus, and he ends up with a very interesting blend there. As to your second question, can you please...
Just about Phonissa, Papargyriou.
Papargyriou. It's an interesting... Well, I think that those two novels have things in common as regards murder, because they both seem to take the side of the murderer in a sense. And about Anopheles diihima, which was based on a true event, Yatromanolakis was heavily criticized. That he focused on the murder and not enough on the victims. I mean, it was a huge case in Crete in the early 1990s. He was writing about. He wrote about it 3 years after it happened, so the event was still very fresh in people's minds. But also in Historia, he seems to be kind of following the psychology of the murderer more than he does justice to the victim.
Do you think there's a reason for that?
There's a reason, because he sees it as political. He says, I mean, he had repaid the damn loan so many times, and still he couldn't escape this sort of vicious circle. Actually, I find it's quite, actual in today's economical session.
Anastasia.
Thank you. It made me think from your start about what is national. I think that we, up to some years ago, decades ago, we are thinking of national bodies around Athens. The language we speak and we are taught now is the language that we were speaking in Peloponnese, the Kimi of Peloponnese then. But what I have noticed is that certain areas like Crete, like Thessaloniki, which also has, as you know, its own literature, and of course for a long time the Ionian Islands, I think it is very important to retain, because Crete, for example, has a special tincture or shade that you can't find in Greece at large, in the sense that, it's very different. And that's why I suppose Erophili and the Autocratos were seen as exotic, as classic iconography, and yet it's a part of Crete. And the same we could say for Papargyriou, who writes what has happened in his own. So I think they are Greek in the sense of today, but I think they keep their own color. And I think that's a fantastic thing to do. I mean, Yatromanolakis is a modernist, and yet he has this color.
But it's interesting what you mentioned Thessaloniki, and although there was a kind of genealogy of writers that were named Thessalonikis, these Volits Thessalonikis and Novan, I think nowadays this tradition has faded in favor of sort of a national literature, whereas with Crete you can still see it. We talk about Cretan authors, we talk about Cretan writers.
It's an
exception.
Yes.
So we have to think why this happens, and if literature in a way perpetuates that, if actually literature creates this exceptionalism in its own ways too.
I think that for Thessaloniki, there is another social or political element here, because the writer feels that if he goes to Athens and if he begins to spread through Athens, he will be more successful, more quickly. Thessaloniki is still thought as a epithete.
But it doesn't depend on where these authors reside, you see, because all of them are in Athens. Marodouka, Galana is a very far. Yeah, but still, they're not in Crete.
I think there is something very specific in Crete, something very powerful.
Anyway, I think shall we move to the next, because David also has a question.
Could I first defend the organisers against the charge
It
restrict the
wasn't.
canon of Cretan
No,
literature?
it wasn't an accusation.
Eleni Papargyriou.
But we did hear this morning from Tina talking about Saklikis and Della Portas, who lived 2 centuries before.
Yes, I said I admitted my expertise
literature
there.
didn't stop in 1957,
Yeah.
but it was the alliteration, wasn't it? I suppose from Kornaros to
Well,
Kazantzakis.
yeah.
And Kazantzakis is always a crowd puller. He's the only modern Greek prose writer that anybody outside Greece has ever heard of, let's face it.
But it is, I mean, it reflects a canon, yeah.
But more seriously, the one that you have up on the screen now, Erotikot, okay, it's written by Cretan, and it is a kind of pastiche of the language of people like Agapios Landos, but the language is not specifically Cretan, although Landos was a Cretan. And I wonder how it might be seen as having a Cretan subject matter, how the book, without the name of Yatromanolakis on the cover, has anything to do with Crete.
I think, well, you say that in Landos this type of dialect doesn't strike you as particularly Cretan in Landos.
Especially so. It's a kind of 17th century, yes. Kind of
So it's
Kini, if you like, Graphene Kini.
But in Yatromanolakis you can see that there is an emphasis on sort of the maybe even the Venetian element, so that you can find Italian words, and there is also an emphasis on other authors who have written on Cretan subject, like Solomos. There is a passage that directly quotes the Figaro di Meni, so you have the appearance of a monk-clad lady. So there is an insistence there, but I think perhaps to the mind of the sort of the average contemporary reader who doesn't have this wide knowledge on language in the 17th century, I think this reads as Cretan. It doesn't read as the standard koina of the 17th century, I think, because that's the perception we have of Cretan dialect. Yes.
Being for I don't know so well Cretan language and Greek language. That's not my language. When I read many years ago the Vorticon in Greek, it seems to me more Empiricos than Language.
Yes,
that's it.
Vegas Anatolico, yes.
Yes, it's not exactly something that is in old-fashioned Cretan language. It is just a joke that Yatromanolakis done. It's more Empiricos than.
Yes, well, the erotic theme, but the language is not, because then you have Cathareo and sort of
a little bit more close to Empiricos language.
Well, there's a question from. Oh, sorry, did you finish, Katerina? Sorry.
I want to ask about also the Caristiani costumi από χώμα που επίσης είναι. Sorry. I try to speak English and Greek together.
It's okay.
Because it's all the same things.
It's the same thing.
It's quite difficult to translate this kind of books in other languages because you have a lot of references that you know. So you haven't this opportunity to understand what's happened in Crete, what is it Crete, so another books like Galanaki, Judas, or Militan, it's impossible to translate in another language. It's a big problem of Greek literature, contemporary literature, because it's a little bit like endogamic literature. So you have to know a lot of histories, a lot of things that Western civilization doesn't know. We haven't any effort to any skills to understand this kind of literature.
Yes.
So,
No, I mean, I completely agree, and there's always the discussion, can Greek literature be exported, how can we make it more available, how can we make it more understandable? And some people have, argued that, it's so historically specific that you can't actually render it.
Well, there was an article in the Times, I think a couple of weeks ago, about a complaint from British publishers that there's not enough translation and that the British literary scene is dominated by English language fiction and lack of translations.
Yeah,
but
they don't do very much.
Well, because the argument was that in order for a British reader to be impressed by a foreign work, it has to offer something considerably different from what the British literature stage is already offering. Yeah. And that was presented as being something quite difficult because... Anyway, I think shall we take two more questions, one from Yorgia and one from Dimitris, I think you wanted to ask.
Sure, but if somebody else mine is theoretical.
Yorgia, you wanted to ask something.
Thank you very much, Eleni, and thank you for the introduction. I think you touched many subjects, and it's a very big discussion. The Cretan literature is a big thing. And I think my question follows a little bit Professor Houghton's questions. First of all, I think we focused on the issue of translation, which is very interesting. And from what the authors you mentioned, I think Yatromanolakis we were discussing that yesterday, is translated.
Yatromanolakis, yeah. Marodouka are not the Cretan ones.
Not the Cretan, yeah. So the first question is, I think, similar to the other remarks, is does the theme of locality interest foreign publishers? And then the second one, which I think you suggested at the end of the presentation, is how can the theme of locality survive or if it doesn't survive through the translation? I think you mentioned that it's probably lost.
Yeah.
Becoming other things which need to be surfaced. So
Yes, I mean, I don't know the background, and perhaps I should ask the translators themselves on, how the kind of the logistics of, if they were assigned the work, if they took it up on their own initiative, how it worked with Daedalus. But I think the crime, it's always a very fashionable topic. And with Historia, I mean, it was published in 1982, and at that time, magic realism perhaps was at its most popular phase. So it was, you have magic realism a la Grec, sort of thing, so why not? And then Report of a Murder followed closely on that and continues on the same.
Dimitri?
Well, my interest in your paper, thank you very much for this paper, relates to my own, which is Thanasis Valdinos. And Thanasis Valdinos is himself translated, and he struggles with his translators about what these things mean. And translators, in other words, go through hell when they meet with Thanasis regarding the actual meaning of what he's... And he's a very local person as well. He writes about the Peloponnese, to a great extent using the local idiom as well. But my question is theoretical regarding the postmodernist, as you put it, novel. And I detected some criteria, echoing other texts, locality being one of the criteria, and exercise in style.
well, exercising style, not in general, but this is kind of combined with what you first, mentioned. This kind
Echoing
of,
other texts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
that-
intertextuality is one
Yeah.
and locality is the other, right?
Yes. Yeah. No, I'm not saying that these two surely exist, but there are many others. I'm not saying I'm defining postmodernism
Right.
sort of in these two
But these
conditions.
are your criteria, right?
Yes, I mean, these two are definitely criteria, but also this anopheles diήγημα, that you cannot actually produce an objective and accurate account of anything.
Right.
I think that's a sort of
Yes.
like a postmodernist trait.
Right, which is what happens in Rococostin as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Right, thanks.
Well, shall any more? Marina. Okay.
Do you find Cretan literature, do you find the term Cretan literature necessary and useful for his work?
I mean, but it's not it's not the case whether I find it necessary. It's fine where I see it. So I see it being reproduced. And in a sense, we cannot escape it. So we need to take it into account.
You said it's problematic.
I use it sort of fully aware that it's a problematic term. I mean, in the case of like Cypriot literature, you can understand why.
Yeah.
But with Cretan
And
literature, again,
we said why we should use this term, but anyway.
but
for
still, you
Cretan
can see the relevance more than you can with Cretan literature, but still you hear it being referred as sort of
Yeah, I'm wondering if we had more people from the Peloponnese, for example, writing, would we be talking about Peloponnesian literature? Would we? Or is the history of Cretan literature?
I think that contributes
Yeah.
very.
Well, there was Heptanesian
Yeah.
There was, but it
literature. There was
anymore.
Athenian, Nea Athinaiki.
We don't talk about Heptanesian literature anymore.
Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, shall we thank the speakers? And now there's 2 hours for you to have a rest. Dinner is at 7 o'clock in the new SCR, which is just on the left here, a big door. If you are in doubt, let's meet at the Porter's Lodge at 7 o'clock and we can come here.
And people might like to walk around the gardens
Yes.
over here if the sun is shining. It's
Well, we have been lucky with the weather today, so maybe it's worth.
Πολύ ωραία τα οργανώσατε. Μπράβο σας.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ.